In the spring of 1947, a continent lay in ruins. Europe, once the crown jewel of human civilization, had been reduced to a landscape of devastation. Bombed-out factories stood silent. Railways twisted like broken spines across the countryside. Millions of displaced persons wandered through cities where hunger was the only certainty and hope seemed a distant memory. This was Europe after the Second World War, a continent that had twice in 3 decades become the epicenter of humanity's capacity for self-destruction. Yet, from this abyss would emerge one of history's most remarkable recoveries, a transformation so profound it would forever alter the trajectory of international relations and redefine the economic architecture of the Western world. This revival wasn't merely a triumph of European resilience. It was engineered through an unprecedented American initiative that would come to be known as the Marshall Plan, perhaps the most successful foreign aid program ever conceived. The devastation that preceded this recovery can scarcely be overstated. World War II had claimed over 40 million European lives and destroyed approximately 1/4 of the continent's wealth. Industrial production had plummeted to less than half of pre-war levels. The winter of 1946-1947 had been particularly brutal, the coldest in memory, exacerbating food shortages and fuel crises. Britain, once the world's financial center, was effectively bankrupt. France's industrial output stood at just 50% of its pre-war level. Germany, divided and occupied, had become a collection of rubble fields, as journalist William Shirer described its decimated cities. European economies that had once driven global commerce now stood paralyzed. Coal, steel, and manufacturing, the backbone of industrialization, were crippled. Agricultural production had collapsed, creating widespread food shortages. The intricate web of intra-European trade lay shattered, with nations lacking the foreign currency reserves needed to import essential goods. The continent faced what economists grimly termed a dollar gap, unable to earn sufficient American currency through exports to purchase vital American goods. It was against this backdrop of desolation that America's policy toward Europe began to shift dramatically. The geopolitical landscape was rapidly transforming. As Winston Churchill had warned in his famous Iron Curtain speech of March 1946, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. The Soviet Union, now extending its influence across Eastern Europe, presented both an ideological and military challenge to Western democracy. By early 1947, the Truman administration had embraced a policy of containment toward Soviet expansion. The intellectual foundations for this approach had been laid by American diplomat George Kennan in his long telegram from Moscow, arguing that Soviet power would ultimately fracture if faced with unalterable counterforce. But containment required stable, prosperous democratic states as bulwarks against communism in Western Europe was anything but stable or prosperous. The catalyst for action came in February 1947, when Britain informed Washington it could no longer maintain its military and economic commitments to Greece and Turkey, where communist insurgencies threatened. President Truman responded with the Truman Doctrine, declaring America's intention to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. The United States had officially committed itself to the defense of democracy abroad. Yet it was becoming increasingly clear that military aid alone couldn't address Europe's fundamental economic crisis. As spring turned to summer in 1947, American policymakers worried that economic collapse would drive desperate Europeans toward communism. The continent seemed to be slipping toward the abyss, with Italy and France experiencing communist-led labor unrest and Central Europe facing continued food shortages. On June 5, 1947, Secretary of State George C. Marshall delivered a commencement address at Harvard University that would alter the course of history. In measured, understated language characteristic of the former Army Chief of Staff, Marshall outlined a vision for European recovery. Our policy is directed not against any country or doctrine, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos, Marshall declared. Its purpose should be the revival of a working economy in the world so as to permit the emergence of political and social conditions in which free institutions can exist. Rather than dictating terms, Marshall called upon Europeans themselves to create the recovery program. It would be neither fitting nor efficacious for this government to undertake to draw up unilaterally a program designed to place Europe on its feet economically. This is the business of the Europeans. The speech, initially underreported in American media, electrified European leaders. British Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin reportedly told a colleague it was one of the greatest speeches in world history. Within weeks, British, French, and Soviet representatives met in Paris to discuss the American proposal. The Soviets, represented by Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, initially participated but quickly withdrew, forbidding Eastern Bloc countries from joining what they denounced as dollar imperialism. By September 1947, 16 Western European nations had formed the Committee of European Economic Cooperation to coordinate the recovery program. Their report to Washington requested $22 billion in its aid over 4 years, an astronomical sum representing approximately 5% of the entire U.S. gross national product. After months of contentious congressional debate, President Truman signed the Economic Cooperation Act on April 3, 1948, creating the Economic Cooperation Administration to administer what was now officially called the European Recovery Program, though it would be universally known as the Marshall Plan. The program represented a revolutionary approach to international economic relations. Unlike traditional aid, which focused on immediate humanitarian relief, the Marshall Plan aimed at structural economic rehabilitation. Paul Hoffman, appointed to lead the ECA, described its mission as moving from palliation to cure. Between 1948 and 1952, the United States would transfer approximately $13 billion equivalent to over $150 billion in today's currency to Western Europe. The program's implementation was as remarkable as its conception. Rather than imposing American economic models, the Marshall Plan operated through a principle of partnership. Each participating nation created its own National Productivity Agency. A counterpart fund mechanism required recipient governments to deposit matching funds in local currency for each dollar received, creating capital for domestic investment. The program established the Organization for European Economic Cooperation, OEEC, to coordinate distribution and foster intra-European cooperation. This collaborative approach yielded extraordinary results. By 1952, Western European industrial production had increased by 35% above pre-war levels. Agricultural output rose 10% beyond 1938 figures. Intra-European trade expanded by 70%. The chronic dollar shortage that had crippled European commerce gradually eased. National infrastructure systems were rebuilt, modernized, and in many cases improved beyond their pre-war capabilities. Yet the Marshall Plan's impact extended far beyond these aggregate statistics. In France, Marshall Aid financed the ambitious Monet Plan for industrial modernization. The renovation of the Gennevilliers power station outside Paris increased French electrical capacity by nearly 40%. New steel plants in Lorraine incorporated cutting-edge technologies. By 1950, French industrial output had reached 111% of its pre-war level. In West Germany, the combination of Marshall assistance and currency reform in 1948 sparked what would become known as the Wirtschaftswunder, the economic miracle. The Deutsche Mark replaced the worthless Reichsmark, eliminating the black market and restoring confidence in the monetary system. Marshall funds helped reconstruct the Ruhr Valley's coal mines and steel plants, laying groundwork for Germany's reemergence as Europe's industrial powerhouse. As economics minister, Ludwig Erhard implemented his vision of the social market economy. German industrial production rose 25% in 1949 alone. Italy directed Marshall aid toward infrastructure development in its impoverished south and modernization of northern industries. The Italian automobile manufacturer Fiat used ECA loans to retool its Turin factories. setting the stage for Italy's automotive export boom of the 1950s. By 1951, Italian industrial production had doubled from its 1947 levels. Britain, though initially receiving the largest share of Marshall aid, presented a more complex case. Much of the assistance went toward addressing Britain's severe balance of payments crisis rather than industrial modernization. Nevertheless, Marshall funding helped maintain essential imports while the Labour government implemented its ambitious nationalization and welfare programs. The smaller nations of Western Europe experienced similarly dramatic transformations. The Netherlands directed Marshall funds toward reclaiming land flooded during the war and modernizing its crucial port facilities at Rotterdam. Belgium rebuilt its vital coal industry. Austria reconstructed its hydroelectric capacity. In each case, American assistance served as catalyst rather than dictate, allowing European nations to pursue their own paths to recovery.
Do you like to dig deeper? Political economy is full of powerful ideas. You're right in the thick of it. Insightful, thought-provoking, expanding every step of the way. From Adam Smith and the rise of capitalism to Marx's bold critique, mercantilism, Keynesian economics, neoliberalism, and more. Or we explore it all, clearly and from every angle. Keep the momentum going. Check the links, dive deeper, and subscribe for more.
Perhaps the Marshall Plan's most profound impact was psychological. As economic historian Charles Mayer has noted, the program helped restore not just the material basis for recovery, but confidence in recovery itself. After years of deprivation and uncertainty, Europeans could envision a future of stability and prosperity. This confidence manifested in increased consumer spending, business investment, and birth rates, the foundations of sustained economic growth. Equally significant was the plan's role in fostering European integration. The OEEC created mechanisms for economic coordination that transcended traditional national boundaries. The European Payments Union, established in 1950, facilitated multilateral trade settlements. As French Foreign Minister Robert Schuman noted in his May 1950 declaration proposing the European Coal and Steel Community, Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements which first create a de facto solidarity. This de facto solidarity was precisely what the Marshall Plan had begun to cultivate. By requiring cooperative planning and resource allocation, the program nudged European nations toward the economic integration that would eventually lead to the European Economic Community and ultimately the European Union. Marshall planners had recognized that Europe's long-term prosperity required transcending the destructive nationalism that had twice plunged the continent into war. The Soviet response to the Marshall Plan proved equally consequential. Stalin viewed the program as an American attempt to undermine Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. In September 1947, the Soviet Union established the Communist Information Bureau, Cominform, to coordinate communist parties throughout Europe. By January 1949, Moscow had created the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, Comecon, as a counterweight to Western economic cooperation. The Berlin blockade of 1948-1949, precipitated in part by currency reforms in western zones of Germany, represented the first major military crisis of the Cold War. As the Cold War intensified, the Marshall Plan assumed an increasingly explicit security function. In September 1950, Congress approved the Mutual Defense Assistance Program, integrating economic and military aid. With the outbreak of the Korean War in June 1950, the emphasis of American foreign assistance gradually shifted from economic reconstruction to military rearmament. By the time the Marshall Plan formally concluded in December 1951, its economic objectives had largely been achieved, allowing the transition to security-focused assistance. The plan's long-term economic legacy would prove remarkably durable. The foundations laid during these 4 critical years supported what economist Eric Hobsbawm has called the golden age of capitalism, the unprecedented period of growth from approximately 1950 to 1973, during which Western European economies expanded at an average annual rate of nearly 5%. Real wages rose steadily, creating a broad middle class. Social welfare systems expanded, providing unprecedented security to European populations. This prosperity enabled the remarkable social and political stability that characterized post-war Western Europe. Christian Democratic and Social Democratic parties established a durable consensus supporting market economies tempered by social protections. Communist parties in Western Europe, particularly in France and Italy, gradually moderated their revolutionary ambitions. By the late 1950s, what political scientist Seymour Martin Lipset termed the end of ideology seemed to have arrived in Western Europe, a striking contrast to the ideological conflicts that had ravaged the continent for generations. The Europe that emerged from the Marshall Plan era was not simply a collection of thriving national economies. It was gradually becoming a community of nations committed to mutual prosperity and cooperation, a profound transformation from the nationalist rivalries that had dominated European history. As French economist and statesman Jean Monnet reflected in 1976, "We are not forming coalitions of states. We are uniting people." This unification, economic, political, and ultimately cultural, represents the Marshall Plan's most enduring legacy. From the rubble of war emerged not just rebuilt factories and modernized infrastructure, but a new conception of Europe itself. The vision, first articulated by American leadership in 1947 and embraced by Europeans across the continent, gradually became reality. A Europe where cooperation replaced conflict, where shared prosperity fostered shared security, where ancient enmities gave way to common purpose.
We've got some amazing content coming your way. Subscribe now so you're first in line for fresh insights and all the good stuff you won't want to miss.